For a very long time, the story seemed settled. Humans found the horse on the Eurasian steppe, tamed it, climbed onto its back, and from that moment, the world accelerated. The first riders ranged farther than any shepherd before them. Entire cultures became mobile in a new way. Migrations widened. Trade routes lengthened. War changed shape. The horse, in this telling, entered history once, early, and never really left. It is a powerful story because it feels clean. It gives us a beginning, an invention, and a consequence. It also happens to be wrong in some of its most important parts. Ancient DNA has done something rare to the history of domestication. It has not merely refined a familiar picture. It has broken it apart. The animal we thought we understood turns out to have a stranger ancestry, a later rise, and a more selective path into our world than almost anyone imagined a generation ago. And that leaves two difficult questions. If the first famous horse keepers were not the true ancestors of the horses that dominate human history, then what exactly is a domestic horse? And if horses did not transform Eurasia at the moment we long assumed they did, then when did they actually begin to change the world? Those questions are more unsettling than they sound. Because once they are asked seriously, the horse stops being a simple companion of civilization. It becomes evidence, a moving archive, a biological record of human ambition, selection, speed, and replacement. For years, one place stood at the center of the old explanation, Butai, in what is now northern Kazakhstan. Around 5,500 years ago, the people there seemed to have lived with horses on an extraordinary scale. Archaeologists found masses of horse bones. They found traces that suggested mare's milk. They found evidence interpreted as corrals. For many researchers, Butai looked like the missing threshold, the place where hunting gave way to management, where wild prey became livestock, where the partnership between horse and human first crossed into domestication. From there, the rest seemed easy to imagine. Once people had horses, of course mobility changed. Of course those horses spread. Of course the horse we know today descended from that first breakthrough. That logic was tidy. It was also built partly on absence. We had archaeology, but not yet a deep genetic timeline stretching across thousands of years and vast regions. We could identify moments of horse use, hints of control, perhaps even riding. But we could not easily trace which horses belonged to which lineages, which populations vanished, and which ones became the biological foundation of the modern domestic animal. Then the genomes began to speak. When researchers extracted and compared ancient horse DNA across wide stretches of time, the result was not a neat family tree leading from Butai to the present. It was a discontinuity, a replacement. The horses associated with Butai did not turn out to be the main ancestors of modern domestic horses at all. That alone was surprising enough. But the deeper shock was stranger. The closest living echo of those Butai horses appears not to be the ordinary horse in a stable, field, or racetrack. It is Przewalski's horse, the stocky, dun-colored animal long described as the last truly wild horse. In other words, one of the great symbols of untouched wildness may instead be the feral descendant of an ancient managed population. That reversal matters because it changes the emotional architecture of the subject. The boundary between wild and domestic, which we often treat as firm, begins to blur. A horse can leave human control and become wild-looking again. A line once entangled with people can survive outside the stable and carry itself into the modern age as if it belonged to a deeper, purer past. So, the first question starts to sharpen. What is a domestic horse? It is not simply a horse that humans once used. Butai shows why that definition is too loose. Human communities could milk horses, manage horses, possibly ride horses, and still not be the source of the lineage that later conquered the old world. Early horse use, even sophisticated horse use, did not automatically produce the horse that would become globally dominant. That realization opens a gap between contact and consequence. Yes, people were engaging with horses earlier than once thought. Yes, there may have been early riding before the great age of chariots and mounted empires. Skeletal studies even suggest that some Yamnaya individuals around 3000 BCE may have spent time on horseback. But early riding, if it occurred, is not the same thing as a continent-spanning horse revolution. A few riders do not yet amount to a transformed world. The older grand narrative fused those things together. It assumed that once people had horses, history changed immediately and irreversibly. Ancient DNA says the timeline was more selective than that. The horses that truly matter for later Eurasian history belong to what geneticists call the DOM2 lineage. This is the ancestry cluster that gave rise to the overwhelming majority of modern domestic horses. And when scientists mapped where its ancestors were living, they did not find its origin in Bottai. They found it farther west in the western Eurasian steppes, especially around the lower Volga-Don region. That is the second fracture in the old story. The horse that became the horse in human civilization does not emerge from the place that first seemed to offer the earliest strong case for domestication. The first widely successful horse lineage appears elsewhere, and it appears later. This is where the chronology becomes decisive. One of the biggest assumptions in steppe history was that horses helped drive the great human expansions out of the Pontic-Caspian world around 3000 BC, the movements often linked to Yamnaya populations and, in some theories, to the spread of Indo-European languages. The image is compelling. Mounted pastoralists crossing immense distances, their mobility amplified by domesticated horses, reshaping the human map of Eurasia. But the genetic spread of the key domestic horse lineage does not line up cleanly with that image. The DOM2 horses, the ones that eventually replaced other horse populations, do not show up across Eurasia early enough to explain those first massive human dispersals. Their explosive expansion seems to begin later, around 2200 BCE. That is not a minor adjustment. It is a shift of centuries. So the second question deepens. If horses were not the engine of that earlier human expansion, when did they become the engine of historical acceleration? To answer that, researchers had to stop looking for a single moment of invention and start looking for a system. The new picture suggests that horse domestication, in a sense that actually changed Eurasia, was not simply the first time humans managed horses. It was the emergence of a particular lineage with particular traits, reproduced at scale, moved rapidly, and favored so strongly by people that it displaced local horse populations from Anatolia to Western Europe to Central Asia and beyond. That is a much stricter definition of domestication. Not contact, not occasional control, not even local husbandry alone. Domestication, in the world-making sense, meant the creation and expansion of a horse population shaped to fit human needs so well that it outcompete nearly every alternative. And the evidence for that shaping is written in the genome itself. Among the most discussed signals are regions associated with behavior and the back. One appears near a gene called CFPM1, linked in ways that suggest selection for more manageable, more stress-tolerant animals. Another sits near GSDMC, a region researchers have associated with spinal and locomotor robustness. The interpretation must be careful. Genes are not simple destiny, and ancient selection is rarely readable, like a label on a machine. But the broader implication is plain enough. Humans were not just keeping horses. They were favoring horses suited to new demands, animals more tractable, more resilient, more compatible with weight-bearing, endurance, and the pressures of transport or warfare. That is when the answer to the first question comes into focus. A domestic horse is not merely a wild horse in a pen. It is a horse population remade by selective human pressure into a different historical instrument. Bottai may still represent an early, important, and regionally profound form of horse management. It should not be dismissed. But it now looks less like the direct beginning of the modern horse world, and more like an experiment, a branch, perhaps even a dead end in terms of the lineage that later prevailed. Significant, yes. Foundational in a broad human-animal sense, perhaps. But not the simple origin point once imagined. And that changes how we think about all early domestication. History prefers firsts. Nature often prefers filters. The horse did not become historically decisive the moment somebody first exploited it. It became decisive when one lineage passed through a narrow set of filters, geographic, biological, cultural, and technological, and then spread with astonishing speed. By roughly 2200 to 2000 BCE, That spread is visible far beyond its steppe homeland. Horses carrying the DOM2 ancestry profile appear in places like Anatolia, the Lower Danube, and Central Europe. Soon after, they expand farther across Eurasia. Within the broader arc of prehistory, this is remarkably fast. And by the 2nd millennium BCE, local horse populations in many regions had been largely replaced. Replacement is one of the coldest words in archaeogenetics, but it often describes a brutal historical truth. What survives in the present is not always what came first. Sometimes the line that wins is later, narrower, and more aggressively propagated. That propagation itself seems to have changed. More recent genomic work suggests that around the time of this rapid expansion, people were exerting tighter reproductive control over horses, including patterns consistent with close-kin mating and shortened generation times. In plain terms, humans appear to have begun breeding these animals more intensively, more deliberately, and with more urgency. This is no longer just a story of taming. It is a story of production. And once horse production accelerated, distance changed its meaning. A horse can do many things. It can pull, carry, flee, pursue, display status, transport messages, extend trade, herd other animals, and alter the tempo of military action. But none of those capacities matters at civilizational scale until enough suitable horses exist, and until humans possess the social and technical systems to use them repeatedly across networks larger than a village or valley. That may be why the true historical turning point appears when it does. Around the late 3rd millennium BCE, the evidence for widespread horse-based mobility strengthens. This is also the era in which spoke-wheeled chariots emerge in places associated with the Sintashta horizon. Whether riding, driving, or both carried the main burden in different regions, the deeper pattern is the same. Horses begin to move from local utility into strategic infrastructure. Once that happens, the horse is no longer just an animal in human society. It becomes part of the machinery by which human societies reorganize themselves. Trade can thicken. Raiding can lengthen. Frontiers can shift faster. Elites can distinguish themselves through control of speed. Messages can outrun foot travel. Power can project farther from its center. The old story was not wrong to sense that horses changed everything. It was wrong about when, where, and through which biological line. And, perhaps more subtly, it was wrong about what kind of everything this was. We often imagine domestication as a gentle deepening of familiarity, humans and animals gradually learning to live together. Sometimes that is true, but the genomic history of the horse reveals something harder. Domestication can also be an act of concentration, a narrowing of diversity, a selection of a few bodies over many, a decision, repeated generation after generation, that some temperaments, some skeletons, some energies will be carried forward while others disappear. The modern horse, then, is not just the descendant of a wild species that became useful. It is the descendant of a historical bottleneck shaped by human preference and spread through human systems. Seen this way, even the map of Eurasia looks different. The first great steppe expansions around 3000 BCE no longer need to be imagined as a thunder of mounted domesticated horses sweeping westward. Some people may have ridden. Some communities may have managed horses intensely. But the genomic evidence suggests that the horse lineage which later dominated had not yet gone global. The world before 2200 BCE may have known horses well, without yet living in a truly horse-transformed order. Then, sometime around that threshold, the order changed. Not because horses suddenly appeared, but because a particular horse did. A horse bred more intentionally. A horse scaled into networks. A horse reproducible enough, durable enough, and manageable enough to travel with power. This later horse was not simply found. It was curated. That distinction matters because it also rescues us from another simplification, the idea that history advances by single inventions. The bit is not enough. Riding is not enough. Milking is not enough. Corralling is not enough. Even domestication in a local sense is not enough. What matters is the convergence of breeding, human demand, mobility systems, and social value. When those align, an animal crosses from being part of life to becoming part of history's infrastructure. And that brings us back to the second question. When did horses actually begin to change the world? It now seems at the first hint of management at Bhutai. Not automatically with the earliest probable riders on the steppe. Not as the simple engine of the earliest Yamnaya expansions. They began to change the world when one domestic lineage escaped locality and entered scale. That moment appears around 2200 BCE, when the Dom2 horses spread rapidly outward from their western steppe homeland and a new era of horse-based mobility took hold. From then on, speed itself became more available, more organized, more political. Distance began to contract for some people and expand for others. The horse became a multiplier. This does not make Bhutai unimportant. Quite the opposite. It makes Bhutai tragic in a specifically historical way. It may represent one of humanity's earliest deep entanglements with horses, and yet not the lineage that won. Its horses survive, if at all, in transformed form, on the margins of the story, in the tough, once called wild Przewalski's horse. Meanwhile, the horse that entered kingdoms, battlefields, trade routes, myths, and empires came from another branch. So, horse domestication is no longer a single door in time. It is a maze of experiments, extinctions, regional traditions, and one extraordinary later success. That is why ancient DNA has been so disruptive here. It does not merely tell us where horses came from. It tells us that we were asking the wrong kind of question. We asked for the first horse humans controlled, as though history would naturally follow first contact. But what history cared about was not first contact. It was scalability, replacement, persistence, spread. The horse was never just the horse. It was multiple horse worlds, only one of which became global. And in the present, that leaves us with an altered definition. A horse is not simply a domesticated animal that helped build civilization. More precisely, the horse that built much of the connected old world was a selected lineage, biologically narrowed and culturally amplified, timed to an age that was ready to use speed as power. That is a colder, stranger, and in some ways more revealing truth than the old legend. Because it reminds us that the past is full of beginnings that do not win, and winners that arrive later than memory prefers. Somewhere on the steppe, long before empires made horses into symbols, people were already trying to live with them. Some milked them. Some managed them. Some may have ridden them across grassland horizons. But the animal that would come to carry generals, merchants, messengers, kings, migrants, and myths was not simply waiting there, fully formed, from the first encounter. It had to be made into history. And if you enjoy following the moments when science makes the ancient world more complicated, not less, then stay with this channel. There are many more familiar things that become strange the closer we look. The old image of the horse was simple, first tamed, then triumphant. The new image is harder to forget. Not one beginning, but several. Not one horse, but competing lineages. Not wild on one side and domestic on the other, but a spectrum of entanglement, loss, and reinvention. Which means the horse was never only an animal we mastered. It was a definition we kept rewriting, until one version of it rewrote the world.